Okay, so thank you for having me. So for today's Neurotuno, I'm going to be speaking to you briefly about communications biology and giving you some information about what we look for in our cognitive neuroscience submissions specifically. So I'll start off by introducing the journal and discussing the benefits of publishing your work in open access journals such as our own. And I'll then speak briefly to you about guided open access, which is a pilot scheme in the Nature portfolio that some of you would have heard of and be interested in. And I'll then finish off by talking specifically about our editorial process and scope for cognitive neuroscience submissions. So let's begin by introducing you to communications biology. Communications biology is an open access journal that is part of the Nature portfolio and publishes across all areas of biological sciences, from neuroscience to biochemistry to evolution. The manuscripts that we consider and take through the peer review process are those that make an important and novel advance for others in the field. And given this scope and criteria, we effectively serve as a Nature portfolio publishing option for more specialized and interdisciplinary topics. Our papers don't necessarily need to have a broad appeal for our editors to consider sending them out to review. At Communications Biology, we have a collaborative model in which manuscripts are handled by both professional full-time editors and by editorial board members who are still very much active researchers in their fields. And we all work very closely together to ensure that there is a level of consistency, not just between different board members, but across different expertise as well. So, as you may be aware, Nature Portfolio is a signatory of DORA, and so we do strongly believe that metrics other than the impact factor should be taken into consideration when evaluating a journal performance. And this is because the impact factor can be skewed very heavily by a small number of highly cited papers, and there could be a huge number of reasons for a large number of citations. So we did not long receive our first impact factor, which is 6.268. But we'd also like to share that our immediacy index, which is the mean number of citations of an article cited in the year that it's published, is over 1. And in addition, our article influence score, which is effectively a ratio of a journal's citation influence to the size of the journal's article contribution over a period of 5 years, is 2.374. With respect to our peer review metrics, it may interest you to know that the median number of days from your initial submission to a first decision of whether to reject or send out to review is 11 days. And this is inclusive of the time that the manuscript is in quality control stages, which can be 2 or 3 days sometimes. In terms of the median number of days from the initial submission to a first post-review decision, we're looking at 48 days, so about 6 weeks. And then in terms of the median number of days from your initial submission to a final acceptance, it's 188 days, so about 6.5 months. At present, we have a team of 8 in-house editors. However, this will be very shortly expanding to 10. We're led by our chief editor, Brooke Laflamme, and our deputy editor, Christina Carlson-Rosenthal. All of our editors have PhDs, and some will also have postdoctoral experience. And as you can see, our expertise between us cover pretty much the range of fields that we receive submissions and publish papers in. So for those of you listening today, if you submit your manuscript to Communications Biology, it's most likely to end up on the desks of myself or George Inglis, who also handles neuroscience submissions. As I mentioned, we do have a collaborative model in which our external board members also handle submissions. And at present, we have about 100 board members whose expertise cover the range of fields that we receive submissions in. As well as having a good representation across all fields of biology on our board, it's also important to us to ensure that we have equal representation in terms of gender, and it's equally important to us to have a good representation across geographical regions. So we're proud to say that our board is more or less 50-50 male to female. And as you can see, we have board members across the globe. And actually, our geographical coverage has recently just been expanded further by our recent submissions. With respect to our board members who specifically handle cognitive and behavioral neuroscience submissions, we have 8. And as you can see, between them, they cover pretty much all of cognitive neuroscience subfields. So when you submit your manuscript to us, we are able to quite reliably match the paper to a suitably qualified board member who will then be able to guide the manuscript through the peer review process with our in-house team. Of course, the main benefit of having our editorial board is that submissions are handled by expert and active researchers who have an up-to-date understanding of the field, and this of course improves the quality of the editorial process. However, in addition, it also means that communications biology keeps a very close relationship with the research community, and we do also have a number of initiatives that keep us as engaged as possible with this community. So just one example of a feature that communications biology has that keeps us engaged with the research community, but also shows our appreciation for the hard work that reviewers put in, is our Reviewer of the Month post. So each month we choose an outstanding reviewer who we feel has made a significant and positive contribution to the review process, regardless of the eventual outcome of the manuscript that they reviewed. Typically, our reviewers of the month tend to take both a broad and detailed look at the paper, and they provide comments that the editor feels very clearly help the authors to improve their work. Another example of our engagement with and support for the research community is our Researcher Spotlight Q&As. These posts tend to focus more on the human side of science, and we select individuals from different fields and different backgrounds who can provide some inspirational and advice to those wishing to pursue a career in research. And we always welcome suggestions for candidates to interview, and self-nominations are also an option as well. So we care very much about reaching out to the research community, but of course we also care very much about the outreach of the science that we publish. And this brings me on to speaking briefly about open access publishing. So communications biology is a gold open access journal, meaning that there is immediate access to the publication with no embargo, and this can be accessed through us directly rather than only through another repository. As I'm sure you're aware, there are a number of benefits to publishing your work open access. Not only does it increase the potential citations and give your work a faster impact, but it also opens up your work to a greater public engagement, as anyone can access this without having a subscription. In addition, open access journals that have very broad scope, such as communications biology, increase the opportunities for interdisciplinary discussions. And because the publications are available to all, it can also open up avenues for collaboration on a global scale and can support those in locations or institutes that may not have access to a large number of subscription content. It's also important to note, and I'm sure you're aware, that many major funders now also require that papers from the projects they fund are published open access. Springer Nature is very committed to open access. With decades of experience, it's actually the largest open access publisher. There are, of course, challenges that come with being an open access publisher. It can be editorially extensive, and we do have to be highly selective. However, it is very much in the origination of the Nature portfolio, which is to serve both scientists and the public. And not only do we have communication series of journals such as Communication Biology, but Nature Communications has actually been fully open access for the last 7 years or so. Both Nature and Nature Research journals now also do have open access options. So at this point, having mentioned Nature, Nature Research journals, and Nature Communications, I'd just like to take a moment to explain where communications biology fits in. So as you can see, that speaking very generally, we're somewhere in between Nature Communications and scientific reports. For papers that have the widest importance and implications, as well as providing the most relevant advance for those in the discipline, we have Nature and the Nature Research journals, which are both transformative. This means that although they're currently subscription journals, they have committed to transitioning to fully open access, and they do currently have open access options available. And then in terms of the journals that are already fully open access, we have Nature Communications, and this is a home for highlighting significant advances, although broad appeal is not always necessary. And of course, we have the communications journals such as Communications Biology, which I mentioned earlier, is a home for important insights in more focused areas of research. Scientific reports is also part of our family, and they are open access, and they tend to be a home for technically sound science that the editors may feel doesn't necessarily provide a conceptual advance, but of course still very much has value to the field. So I'd like to move on now to talk a little bit about another open access option that we're currently piloting in the Nature portfolio, and this is called guided open access, and some of you may have heard of this. So the main aim of guided open access is to make the publishing process simpler and more efficient, as well as to help authors find the most suitable home for their work with a single submission. So if you submit your work to the pilot scheme, it will be considered by 3 different journals simultaneously. In terms of the type of work that people listening to this talk produce, the most relevant stream of the pilot would be the Nature method stream. So for example, a manuscript which perhaps presents high resolution imaging techniques or improved generation of network connectivity maps. These are the kinds of manuscripts that would fit into this stream. So when you submit, editors at Nature Communications, Nature Methods and Communications Biology will all assess your work at the same time and discuss your work together. Regardless of the outcome, you'll then receive a tailored editorial assessment report. And because of the way the scheme is costed, the cost of the editorial evaluation and the publication are uncoupled. So actually with this scheme, you could end up publishing open access in a Nature research journal at nearly half the cost compared to if you submitted using the current system. So just to explain a little more about the process at different stages, when you submit your manuscript to the pilot, as I said, editors from all 3 journals will initially discuss whether or not the paper is first suitable for the process. And they'll make a preliminary decision about which journal would be most suitable and therefore which editor guides the manuscript through the peer review process. If it's found to be suitable for the pilot and sent out to review, reviewers will then be contacted to assess the manuscript. And once the reports come back, the editors from all 3 journals will again discuss the manuscript together in light of the reports, and they'll create a tailored recommendation to the authors in the form of an editorial assessment report. So these reports are designed to provide authors with a detailed editorial evaluation that helps them to navigate and interpret the reviewer comments. The editors will also provide guidance to the authors about the best practice for adhering to openness, transparency, and reproducibility of their work. Having discussed the manuscript, the editors will then make a very clear recommendation to the authors about the most suitable journal in the pilot for the publication. And the report will then contain some very clear advice about how to make the steps needed for this publication. Importantly, these reports will be able to go with you wherever you choose to eventually submit if it's not with one of the journals in the pilot scheme. So they can be sent to other journals should you choose to go elsewhere. So aside from giving a recommendation, the report will also contain some very clear guidance about the levels of revisions that will be needed for publication in the event that the manuscript could be suitable for more than one of the journals in the pilot. And in addition to this, it will also clearly point out which revisions from the review reports the editors consider to be most crucial for the manuscript. And the main reason for such specific and personalised instructions are not only to provide you with the best author experience, but to promote fair principles for data and code, ensure ethical standards are upheld, and to promote reproducibility by improving the way in which you report your methods and statistical analysis. So I mentioned that guided open access is more efficient and it's a more faster way to find a home for your manuscript. So if we take a look at a theoretical scenario for the usual way in which papers are submitted, you may initially submit your fMRI paper, for example, to Nature Methods. The editors there will assess it and send a decision to you within about a week. If it doesn't meet that bar and you then try Nature Communications, again, you may find in about a week or so that it could just fall short of their bar. And so you then try Communications Biology, and again, you wait a week for a decision. So perhaps from the initial submission to then eventually Communications Biology, for example, sending it out to review, you could be looking at close to a month. However, if we take a look at how guided open access works, because the editors are working simultaneously, you could receive a decision and have your paper sent out to review within a week. What's crucial to understand is that with guided open access, as well as getting this very valuable document that guides you about revising your manuscript. In the event that the review reports come back glowing and the paper is actually more solid and impactful than the editors initially thought, there would then be an opportunity to change the journal that ends up publishing the article, whereas of course this wouldn't be an option using the usual system unless you withdraw and resubmit from scratch to another journal. So to summarize, guided open access is a new option for authors at the Nature portfolio that really has an emphasis on providing the best possible service to our authors by increasing efficiency and getting very specific and clear guidance from one of the editors. And as part of the process, you get your detailed report that gives you insight into the editorial process. And this advice will not potentially just help you with your submission, but also with future manuscript preparation to any journal. So I'd like to spend the last few minutes now talking about cognitive neuroscience submissions at communications biology. So as mentioned earlier, when I was talking more broadly about the submissions we consider, for any cognitive neuroscience papers that we receive, we require that they provide a very clear mechanistic, biological or anatomical insight or advance. And this can be either in a broad or a specialist topic. On some occasions, we will also consider a connecting the dots paper if this connection is novel and if it's of interest or use to the community. Sometimes we will also consider something that may not have a clear conceptual advance, but has extensive resource value. And speaking of such submissions, we do also consider methods papers if they quite clearly provide a technical advance that can shape future discoveries. So using the same examples I gave for the guided open access method stream, this could include high resolution imaging techniques or the improved generation of network connectivity maps. In terms of sample sizes, this really does vary according to the type of data and the participants used, as well as the experimental design. And our editors really judge this on a case-by-case basis. So if, for example, the experiment is longitudinal, requires training and generates a lot of data per participant, then we would accept a lower sample size than if the experiment was, say, short, didn't include any training and had a simple readout. We do also consider computational studies, and again, these are very much considered on a case-by-case basis. However, in general, we do usually require an element of benchmarking, and we always require a very clear and accessible demonstration of the advance. And of course, this criteria is quite general and arguably vague in places, and that's because every manuscript we get is very different. So to help give you a clearer picture about the kind of cognitive neuroscience papers that communications biology publish, I would just like to very briefly run through 3 examples of some of our published papers. So in the first example, the authors provide a neuroanatomical correlate for the observed interactions between sleep duration, cognitive ability, and BMI. In this case, they do also provide a genetic link. However, the neuroanatomical correlate would have been enough alone for us to consider this as within our scope. In the second example, authors use up-to-date technology to reconstruct occipital intralobar fasciculi, and this is within the scope of communications biology because the latest reconstruction improves our understanding of the anatomy and would have resource value. Finally, in the third example, the authors develop and validate software that analyzes a range of patient data from clinical observations to histopathology to neuroanatomy. The reason this was within our scope is because it had the capacity to uncover more about patient-specific underlying mechanisms of disease. And so this has biological relevance in addition to the obvious clinical relevance. So at this point, it's important for me to be explicit about what communications biology is not a home for. So we don't consider case studies with an N of 1, for example. And if there is a case study with a few patients, we do require functional analysis rather than just clinical observations. We also don't consider data dumps. There does need to be a very clear hypothesis or application of the data. And we don't consider piecemeal studies or studies which would have clinical or psychological relevance only. There would need to be an element of mechanistic or neuroanatomical insights for us to consider the manuscript. So, for example, we would reject a paper that only has a readout for psychological value. So, for instance, rating emotions or experiences, reporting reaction times, or measurements such as pupil reflexes only. We would also reject a paper for which the main result only has clinical relevance, for example, changes in clinical examination or diagnostic protocol. Whilst we do appreciate the value of these studies, they aren't within our scope. We also have some subfields that we're especially interested in attracting submissions in this year. So we consider all cognitive neuroscience submissions that fit the criteria that I've just discussed. However, we are especially interested at the moment in receiving submissions that are focused on underlying mechanisms of mental health, as well as the gut-brain axis in the context of psychiatry. So just to summarize before opening up to questions, Communications Biology is an open access journal that publishes in all fields of biology. Our manuscripts are handled by both in-house editors as well as editorial board members, and we work closely together to ensure consistency and the most up-to-date expertise. And we welcome all cognitive neuroscience submissions that provide biological or anatomical insights or have resource or methodological value. And finally, please keep our guided open access pilot in mind if you do have some core methods papers. So thank you very much for your time today, and I'm happy now to take any questions at all.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting presentation. I definitely learned a lot more about the Nature group and in particular comms biology. Are there questions in the room? No, not yet. Oh, Patrick, yes.
So yes, thank you very much for this intelligent presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned 3 research journals who currently have guided open access. I care to notice that Nature Neuroscience is obviously not yet in there, but is it planned to extend the this protocol to the other journals?
It's a little bit too early to say. This is very much in the pilot stage. It only started a few months ago, and I think it will keep going for a little bit longer, just to gauge whether or not it's something that authors are finding useful and they are interested in. And then I think further down the line, then of course it has the potential to expand to more journals, but there's no plans at the moment, given how preliminary the pilot is.
Thanks.
Michelle, you also have a question.
Hi, Karli. Very nice presentation. Thanks. I was wondering, for the guided open access, what would be the process if one would like to submit a paper to this scheme?
So we do have, I don't actually have the link here, but I can send to you. We do have a submission page. It's just the same as the manuscript tracking system that you would normally use for communications biology or Nature Communications, but it's a guided open access tracking system. So you would just submit it and the same would apply, the quality control, and then the editors would take it. But there's nothing in particular that you'd have to do differently. It's just a different tracking system that you submit to, and it works the same as our other tracking systems for the author. So.
Great. Is that a second question, or did you just accidentally put?
Yeah, no, I have a second question.
Okay,
didn't want to steal the turn to anybody. So, do communications biology accept letters or opinion pieces, or
So the content that we accept is, so we accept original research articles. We accept reviews as well, although we don't tend to publish very many reviews, especially if they haven't been invited. We publish commentaries or comments. So these are about, just a few pages in length, commenting on anything really, a particular recent publication or something like this. And we also accept perspectives, but those are the only content types that we do accept at the moment. So I would say if you want to submit a kind of opinion piece type thing, then I would say a comment or a perspective would be suitable.
Lovely. I just briefly want to, Michelle, just how many questions do you have?
Well, I can do that all day.
Let me just say, for the people over on YouTube watching us, feel free to write your questions in the chat and I will bring them over here live on Zoom. Valentina.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Hi, Karli. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you, do you have any advice for a young researcher in writing the submission letter or the abstract to capture the attention of the editor?
Yeah, so I think a lot of younger researchers do underestimate the power of the abstract and the cover letter. So what we want from a cover letter is very much to just get a snapshot of what the manuscript is about, and we would like it explained to us what is the novelty that the submission is offering, what is the advance, what was already known in the field, and how is this contributing to the field. In terms of perhaps, say, PhD students who may be interested in, transforming, say, their thesis chapters into manuscripts that would be suitable for communications biology, we're currently developing some workshops, which will be run by myself and another editor, Luke Grinham, who is actually taking the lead on that. And that will be very much including the cover letter, breaking down how you can best write your manuscript from your thesis chapters, how you can attract the attention of the editor, and how you can make things clear for the reviewers and the community. So that's a workshop that will be coming up towards the end of the year. So we'll be advertising about that.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the noise.
That's okay.
That sounds like a very good idea. There is a question in the chat that says, what are your policies about publication of replication studies?
So it really depends on the context of why it's a replication study. If it's we do very much care about reproducibility, and I think replication studies are very important for this. So for example, it is important to not just have a large number of subjects, but perhaps to repeat the experiment again. But I think the main reason why we would be a little reluctant to consider replication studies is because they don't necessarily produce an advance. And for us, we do need the manuscript to produce a clear conceptual or mechanistic advance. We do very much appreciate the importance of these replication studies, but they would be more at home in scientific reports than communications biology, because they're solid science, they're very important, but they're not necessarily offering some kind of advance. So I would say we would consider them. The only reason we would perhaps send something like that out to review is if we did feel it had, say, resource value, if it was repeated in a very large number of samples, if there was a lot more information, then perhaps on resource value we could consider those, but in general they would be more at home in SciRep.
Great, thank you. Patrick.
Could you maybe let us know about the numbers of submissions you're receiving, and potentially also the percentage of papers that get into the review process and from then on getting published?
Yeah, in terms of the overall number, I'm not quite sure. I think it's in the region of about 2,000 to 3,000 a year. I may have made that up, but I'm not quite sure about that. In terms of the percentages, we don't actually have a target at all. It's just a result of our editorial process. And it's surprisingly quite consistent between different subfields. We tend to have, say the percentage of manuscripts that end up going out to review ends up being about 60 to 70%, possibly slightly higher depending on the subject. Although we do actually have some subjects where it's slightly lower, like 50, 60%. So it does vary a lot. And then out of the manuscripts that say they go to review, the percentage of those that end up being accepted for publication is in the region of about 30 to 35%. Sorry, of the total submissions, it ends up being 30 to 35%, not just the ones that go out to review. We have different metrics for different subfields, but you're looking at the number of papers we get landing on our desk to those that end up on our website, you're looking at about 30%, at the end of the day.
Thanks.
I think Michelle was first. No, she already gave it to you. Take it.
Okay. So Karli, becoming a professional editor is a different career track in academia. And I was wondering whether you could share with us your experience, because that might be inspirational for some of us here.
Yes, so for me, I mean, I started at Communications Biology. It's my first editorial job, and I started October 2020. So I've been at the journal for about 10 months. Prior to that, I was actually in academia for close to 15 years. I was a postdoc for over 10 years. And it just got to a point for me where I needed to change career. And of course, it is kind of scary to change career, because academia does have a very certain way of working and thinking, and you can become institutionalized. But I would say that becoming an editor, actually, I've learned more science as an editor in the last 10 months than I learned throughout my academic career. Maybe I did something wrong in my academic career, I don't know. But you become very focused in academia. And the more senior you become, the more focused your work, of course, has to become. So if you're the kind of person where actually you miss learning about new fields that are, further removed from what you're doing, an editorial job would be perfect for you. And you do start to realize the importance of the role of the editors in ensuring that the science is good quality, is reported transparently. You're kind of like gatekeepers. And I didn't fully appreciate that as an academic. In terms of how your life changes, how the workload changes, you're not doing experiments anymore, and you get to have a larger variety of tasks that you do depending on the journal. So you assess manuscripts, you have different initiatives, you still go to conferences and network. There's always still a lot of opportunity to stay very much engaged with the scientific community. And you have a permanent job. So, it's like the gold standard, right? So I would say anyone who's thinking of leaving academia or can't see, much of they can't really see themselves staying in academia for much longer, I would give editorial roles serious consideration, because it is kind of a science adjacent field. And it is a way to stay very much up to date with the science, still engage in the science, and to learn new things, and to still have a role of that, like in what's being put out there to the public and other scientists. So I would very much recommend it, and don't be scared to change if you're not happy. So yeah.
Thank you very much. You're also currently recruiting, you mentioned during your presentation.
We've recruited.
You recruited.
We've just recruited 2 new editors. One will be joining us in August, who has computational expertise, and one will be joining us in November, who has more cell biology expertise. So we will be expanding, but we're not currently recruiting.
Okay. Leah, your question.
Yes. Thank you, Karli. The presentation was really clear, really nice. And I was impressed about how fast you give the answer from the editor. And I was wondering, if you pass the first step, what happened next? So how is the time tracked usually? How reviewers are chosen based on what happened after?
Mm-hmm. It can vary very much between fields, and very much depending on the time of year. And the reason for that is that, say we send it out to review, we aim to, both the in-house team and the external board members do aim to secure all the reviewers needed. So we aim for 3 within, say, 2 weeks. But of course, there are certain times of year when there's a lot of conferences, there's a lot of grant deadlines. So sometimes it can take a little bit longer, but that is, roughly what we're aiming for. And we then give the reviewers about 2 weeks to write their report, but of course they can always extend that. So at present, from sending it out to review to trying to give you the first decision, we're aiming for about 40 days. Sometimes, usually it's less, but sometimes it can be a bit more. And then depending on the nature of the revision, if we feel it's quite a minor revision, so just textual changes, some analysis changes, you're given a rough guide of about 3 months to complete that. But that's not a strict deadline, that's more of a guide. So if you need more time, you can. If it's a major revision, so experiments are needed, we give that about 6 months. But again, that's flexible. And if you need longer, especially with COVID, for example, that's absolutely fine. If we feel that the amount of work needed to get the manuscript up to scratch is going to be much longer than 6 months, then we would tend to reject that because we feel that that's not within the scope of a revision for us. So you then resubmit, you've done your changes, the same reviewers will then be contacted, and this time they're given about 10 days to submit their reports of the revised manuscript. Sometimes it can take longer. So we aim to give your second decision after the revision within about 30 days or less. And then we have, so at the Nature portfolio, we have something that's called Accept in Principle, which other journals don't. So the Accept in Principle stage at the Nature portfolio is we have accepted the manuscript, but we just require you to maybe do a few more minor things and change it so that it's within our format. Then it goes through quality control and you resubmit it, and then it's finally accepted. So that's kind of the general flow. It can vary in terms of time and what needs to be done with each manuscript, but that's, generally speaking, that's the flow that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Victor, you also have a question.
Yes, thank you. So this new submitting scheme with submission to three journals at the same time is very attractive for researchers. But I was wondering if there were cases where you think that it would be better to directly submit to one of these three journals, or if it's better to always do the three at the same time.
So there have been circumstances where the editors feel that the manuscript is not necessarily suitable for the journal. And that's when it's either, say, not possibly even reaching the editorial bar for communications biology. And then it wouldn't be fair to put it through the pilot and to take up time and to get authors to spend that money. If, however, it looks like, okay, this is very clearly for communications biology, we would perhaps then consider rejecting it from the pilot, but then recommending that they submit to communications biology. So that's very much, there is a first, you feel free to submit manuscripts to the pilot, but there's very much a first triage stage in which they do decide whether or not it's fair to let it continue through the pilot, or if you should just submit direct to the journal. And it very much depends on what we feel is best for the authors and the manuscript.
All right, thank you.
Can't see a question at the moment, so I'm just going to chip in with a few more questions from my side. So you already talked about your trajectory a little bit and your background, but I was wondering if there is a skill you think that is essential to have when you're an editor, like being a speed reader, being very diplomatic with all the parties involved, those kind of things, and what the biggest surprise for you was changing from academia to being an editor?
I think the most important skill, certainly for someone who was in academia for quite a long time and then becoming an editor, is to differentiate between being an editor and being a reviewer. So as an editor, you tend to make your decision about whether or not to send the manuscript out to review very much based on the advance and the novelty that the manuscript offers. You don't make your decision based on the technicalities, unless of course there are big, red flags or some integrity issues, and you can see quite clearly this is fundamentally flawed technically. But usually we would very much lean towards sending it out purely on novelty. And this is for the in-house editors. For the editorial board members, because they're still active in the fields and they're experts, we still encourage them as much as possible to make the decision based on the advance. But if they do notice something technically that really concerns them and it's going to be too much of a headache to address, then there can be exceptions. So I think for me, the most important skill is to differentiate between being an editor and a reviewer. And that was very difficult for me at the start because I did pick up on all the technical problems and I didn't want to send out papers because I thought, well, that's not technically great. So you have to kind of adjust a little bit. The most surprising thing for me, the most surprising thing for me, I think, is how much I've enjoyed handling manuscripts that are not neuroscience. My whole background, my PhD, my postdoc, everything neuroscience, my whole career neuroscience. So I went in there very much like, well, I only want to see the neuroscience papers because that's my field. But actually, it's really exciting. I had a manuscript recently, Plants in Space. You know, who wouldn't be interested in plants in space? And that's something that I wouldn't have even looked at as a neuroscientist. So I'm surprised about how much I've enjoyed non-neuroscience papers and how much I'm learning from them. So that's been really great.
Sounds fantastic. I definitely know one person who would be very interested in plants in space here in this group. Plants in space just distracted me from the question I had. I lost it. It's gone. Any other questions in the meantime until my question comes back to me? Oh, I remember. So you mentioned, sorry, if there's any questions, I'll come back to you. You mentioned earlier that in your team, everyone has a PhD, some even have postdoc experiences. So what would be the most junior level for someone to leave academia and come over to be an editor? Is a PhD required?
Yeah, so for the Nature portfolio, PhDs are required. The most junior, you could come straight out of your Viva and walk into, you know, if you've got the necessary skills and expertise, you can come straight out of your Viva and walk into an editorial position with us. And we do require a PhD, and the reason for that is because we feel that the editors do need to be qualified and have enough experience to be able to assess the manuscripts. So communications biology is kind of half and half, in-house editors and editorial board members, but other journals in the portfolio, such as Nature Communications, Nature Neuroscience, it's only the in-house editors. So it's very important that they do understand the science, how the experiments are done. So that's why we require a PhD. Not all journals or publishers require a PhD. There are some other publishers where the editorial role is a little bit different. And so you don't necessarily need a PhD, but for nature journals, you do.
Great, thank you. So that's a pretty 360 on how to publish in Comms Biology and how to work for Comms Biology or other nature group journals. Are there any other questions in this group? No, you're all happy? You probably get a flood of papers coming your way after this. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was absolutely fascinating, and I definitely learned a lot. Lovely to have you today. And also thanks for kicking off this Meet the Editor special event for Neurotino. This was the first live event we had, and I greatly enjoyed it. So I hope this is the first of many to come. If there's no further questions, thank you all for coming today. We hope you have an exciting week in science. And I just want to plug that we have a talk this Thursday at 4 p.m. Paris time on connectomics and neurological impairment and recovery. So do join us for this one, especially because this is the last week before the summer break. So Neurotino and CNS talks and everything we do will take a little breather for August, and we'll be back in September. So join us this Thursday for the CNS talk and have an exciting week in science. See you soon. Bye.